It's time to start the session. Grid Systems and Android by Soham. Please give a warm welcome to Soham.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Soham and I'm here to talk to you about grid systems and Android. Quick introduction to myself. I'm Soham. I'm the founder of a company called Trivius. We make an audio recording platform called Skyro. It has more than 1 million downloads across various platforms. And I've learned a lot building that platform from scratch. I'm also a Google developer expert on user experience. I'm an organizer with GDG DLR Droid. It's one of the oldest and biggest Android communities in India. Also an Android and UX consultant. I've worked with a lot of different companies over the years, and I specifically focus on applications which are offline first. Connectivity is a very big problem in India, and I build applications that are offline first, that are designed to work offline first, and then online as a second stage. So today we are here to talk about grid systems, right? And quick show of hands, how many of you are developers over here? Okay, and how many of you are designers? Cool. So no designers, so it's going to be a good session for everybody, right? So I'll begin with telling you a bit about grid systems, what they are all about, right? Give you some context into the different types of grids and why they are useful. And then I'll talk about material design and the grid systems in material design. How can you use those specific grids to the maximum advantage, and how can you create great Android applications based on that? So what is a grid system? This is the Wikipedia definition. What's important over here, I've just highlighted that a grid system is basically a structure of intersecting straight lines used to structure content. Right? So in simple words, grids are basically an intersection of different lines, and they help you structure content. So grid serves as a framework on which a designer can organize graphical elements in a rational, easy to absorb manner. So if you have different pieces of content in your application, it could be text, it could be video, it could be images. You can use the grid to depict them in an easy to absorb and rational manner on the screen. Right? That's the very basic definition of a grid. So let me illustrate that with a couple of examples, right? Different types of grids that you might have seen everywhere. The first grid that's on the screen right now is called the manuscript grid. Have you seen this before? Anyway, yes, please. In paper books, right? Where else? In any software that you might have used, Microsoft Word, right? In any kind of text editor, this is the default format that's out there, right? So this is called manuscript grids because you can write manuscripts or books are typically written in this format. Right? There's a central rectangular area where you can show content, and the grid is typically invisible in nature. Right? If you're editing a document in Microsoft Word, you don't see the grid. The red lines, you don't see that, right? Because it's invisible by default. With the grids, you can add some information like the headers and footers. You can adjust the margins, right? It's a very common grid that's out there. Historically, it's been very important because a lot of books have been published over the years using the manuscript grid. The next kind of grid that's extremely common even today is the column grid. This is where the content is broken down into different columns. So this is a typical newspaper reading online or on a print format of newspaper. You can see how the content is in different columns. Right? This is one column. This is another column. This is another column. So the way it's arranged is basically a column grid. Okay? It's not just present in newspapers. It's present all over the place. This is a typical blog. Right? It's an internet blog, and you can see all the content here is organized into different columns. Right? So there is one column over here and another column over here. and it's present in magazines as well. It's a very, very popular format. You might have used this, you might have read about this, right, all the time. So you can see over here there are three specific columns. All the columns have the same width, right? So it's used everywhere. It's used in magazines, newspapers, online, everywhere. Another very popular type of grid is called the modular grid, right? Where you just don't have columns, you also have rows. When you want a little more versatility or you want control of how the content is displayed, right, you can use the modular grid where you have columns as well as rows. Over here you have the image which takes not just specific columns but it goes into other rows as well. So the launchers of many mobile phones, this is the Apple iPhone, you have the Android phones. The launchers are typically a modular grid. You might have used this again. Another subset of types of grid is called the baseline grid. Text is typically aligned to the baseline. What is the baseline? Baseline is the line that you write text on. Okay, so even in Android applications or newspapers and magazines, text is always aligned to the baseline. And you might have seen this, right? Have you used a notepad before? Right? So when you write anything on the notepad, the line that you're writing on is the baseline. Okay, so this is used everywhere. The same baseline is used even in your Android applications. And of course, there are more complex type of grids. This is a hierarchical grid uh, where the designer has the freedom to structure content based on the priority or the importance of the content. Over here, this is a news site again. Over here, they want to focus on the most important piece of news first, right? So this grid is defined in a certain way so that the top news is directly in the center, whereas secondary news is over here and then the third news is somewhere else. Okay, so it's a hierarchical grid. So grids are not just there on magazines or newspapers, it's there everywhere. I showed you on the web as well. So the typical format that you might have seen on the web is called Bootstrap. How many of you have heard of Bootstrap? Right, a lot of you. Right, so Bootstrap is a very common format for arranging or layouting objects on the web itself. So you can use Bootstrap, and I'm sure you've heard of Bootstrap before. So you've seen different types of grids. You've seen column grids, modular grids, and so on. What are some of the advantages of using or layouting different structures in that grid itself? The first is it makes the content more systematic. Okay, so you might have different types of information. You might have news, you might have videos, you might have images. Right? A grid helps you lay out all that information in a very logical, easy to understand manner. Okay, that's the first real advantage of the grid itself. You don't have to worry about the specific type of content and how you should arrange it. The second advantage of having a grid system and following a grid system, it's very economical in nature. What do I mean by that? Just imagine if you were publishing a newspaper every day and you had to come up with new structures of defining them and laying that content out. It would be such a tough task, right? Every single day you have to figure that out. It makes it very easy for us to define a grid structure and then laying out all the content based on that grid structure. That's a really big second advantage. Finally, all these grids are very scientifically designed. It helps your content be more readable, right? So that your users can read it in an easy way and so that they can understand and recollect better. So there's a lot of research going back into how these grids are created. So now that I talked about what are the basic characteristics of a grid system, let me talk about how do you create a grid system, right? That's very, very important. The first consideration while creating a grid system is legibility. Your content should be easy to read and easy to remember. The other thing is viewing distance. The way you would design a grid for a phone would be completely different from how you'd structure it for a newspaper, because the distance at which you read something is completely different in both cases, right? So that is another very important consideration in constructing a grid. For most modern grids, which are column grids in nature, I talked about, it's very important to understand the number of columns that you have in the grid, right, and the width of each column. And that takes us to material design, right? So let's talk about material design and what's the grid that's present in material design. So material design has an 8 dp square baseline grid. Okay, so it's 8 dp by 8 dp. Okay, and this is for aligning most of your elements in material design. It could be buttons, it could be anything else. For most elements, you would align to this 8 dp square grid. For text and icons, however, you can align to a 4 dp baseline grid. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with dp? Almost everybody. So just to give an overview, right? DP is density independent pixels. Right? So you cannot talk about pixels when you're designing something because the amount of pixels in a certain size of phone or a tablet completely depends on the phone, right, or the tablet. So instead of that, we use something called DPs or dips, which is very similar to how you would measure centimeter or anything else. It doesn't change according to the density of the phone, right? It's constant across. So coming back to the grid itself, for text and for icons, you can align to a 4 dp grid. So this is the same baseline grid that I showed you in the notebook. It's the same thing. But for text, you can align it to the same 4 dp grid. Apart from the basic layout grid, Android and other frameworks give us some additional guidance or help, right? So this additional guidance is to structure and lay out specific elements, some key elements. In the case of Android, it's the primary content that you want to show in your application. In this case, it's the title and subtitle of whatever you're showing, right? In the case of an email application, it's the subject of your email. That's the most important thing. So Android gives us some more guidance of how to lay those things out, right? And that is what keyline is. So keyline is basically a line which helps you align key elements in your application. These are two specific keylines in the Android application. I'm sure you've heard about these. On the left hand side is the first key line where you can align secondary content. In this case, it's the avatar image, it could be the time, it could be some secondary information. The second key line that keeps on changing over here is the primary key line, right? It's where you structure your most important content in the app. So if you define that this is the most important thing, you can use this key line to showcase it over there. Why is this important? Because many other applications like Gmail and Maps and so many other applications use the same key line to structure their primary content. So when you design something according to the key lines, your app is using the same technology and the same kind of methodology that other apps are using. So people know where to look and where to find the most important content. And there's this rhythm across applications of Android. So going back to the previous slide, you can actually change. There are certain guidance in terms of where you place the second key line, right? You can change that depending on the kind of content. Of course, a lot of developers in the room, I'm sure you're familiar with padding, which is the spacing between elements. Right? Typically, you'd also have this in multiples of 8 dp or 4 dp, which is part of the baseline. It's also important to talk about vertical spacing. Okay, so what is vertical spacing? It's the height of certain key aspects of your app. Okay, so we'll talk about three specific elements over here. First is the system bar. Right? No matter what Android phone you use, typically the system bar would be 24 dp in height. In a very similar way, the toolbar over here would be 56 dp for a phone. Right? And a typical list element is approximately 18 dp. Of course, that changes as per design. But these are some important measures. Why is this important? Because of a concept called increments. Right? So I talked about the basic layout grid, I talked about baseline grid, but sometimes you don't know how wide a thing should be, right? When you're designing something or implementing something, you have to understand, I have a central area of text that I want to show, but how wide should it be? I don't know that, right? So if you want to decide how wide it should be, you can use increments or multiples of any vertical spacing that I talked about previously, right? So if you have a vertical spacing for the toolbar, which is 56 dp, and in this case it's a tablet, so it's 64 dp. The width of any element can be a multiple of 64 dp, right? It creates a kind of rhythm in your application that makes things more fluid and more logical, right? that's one way to kind of measure how a wide a thing could be, right? So in this case, the width of the central content area is 8 times 64. Okay, that's how you determine a lot of the other characteristics of the application. Okay, another really important thing, right, apart from just laying things out, is adapting to different screen sizes and orientation changes. Apart from the basic layout, you also want to understand how the same layout would work on a bigger screen or TV or something else. So I'll talk about certain key terms over here, right? First is columns. I've talked about column grids, and in Android, we primarily follow columns, right? Just on the web. It's a very similar concept where you have different columns. In this case, it's a tablet or a desktop uh, environment, and you have about 8 columns over here. The columns are marked in red. The spacing between columns or the spacing between content is called gutters. Okay, this is the blue area on the screen. And finally, the area at the side of the screen between the edges of the screen and the content is called margins. Right? Uh, so these are three important terms that you have to keep in mind while designing a scalable user interface. So let's talk about different screen sizes and how you would align content in those different situations. So in this case, we have a phone layout, which is approximately 360 degrees. Material design says that you should have approximately 4 columns over here, right? So 4 columns, and also specifies the margins and the gutters for the specific phone layout. Clear? In case of a tablet, which is approximately 600 dB, you would have about 8 columns. Okay? So material design provides this very interesting terminology called breakpoints, okay, which gives us different buckets of devices. So in case you're designing for a phone, it specifies that, okay, for phones, you should have 4 columns, and this is the typical size of the margin and the gutter for that specific breakpoint. It also specifies the breakpoints for tablets, for desktops. This is all there on the material design guidelines page. Also provides all the guidance you need in order to create a grid for that specific device. And you can see how a similar design, right, which is designed uh, for the phone, can then scale to any other thing. Right? It could scale to a tablet over here, or it could scale to a desktop or a TV layout, right? Just by varying the number of columns and the margins and the gutters. Okay, so on the phone you have a 4 column layout. On a tablet you have like an 8 column, and then even larger you can have a 12 column layout. So material design, as per the breakpoints, provides all the values for your gutters. So in this case, it's a phone, so the gutter has a 16 dB value, right? That's how you design for the phone itself. But for the same layout, if you go to a bigger screen, the gutter increases to 24 dB, right? So, you can align the same kind of content. If you want to take an Android app, make a tablet version, you can just change the gutters to a larger value and then figure out how you can design for a bigger device. In a similar way, margins are typically 16 dBs on a phone. And for a bigger device, like a tablet, you can increase that to 24 dB. Right? These are the standard guidelines that Android provides. But it's not always that you have to follow these very, very strictly. You can customize the grid based on your requirements. For example, over here, uh, the gutters are only 8 dB. Right? This provides a lot of coherence between different elements on the screen. If you have different pictures over here, it shows that they are very strongly linked together, linked to each other. Right? So by varying the gutters or the difference between the spaces in the columns, you can show content in a different way. You can show the relationship between content. If you want to show elements are different from each other, each element has its own identity, then you increase the gutter value. Right? Over here, you have a gutter value of 32 dB. You can see how your mindset and how you read the code changes. Right? The whole mindset changes once you increase the gutter value. Okay, let's look at margins. The same rule applies to margins. Over here, you have an 8 dB margin. When you want a lot of area for your content, right, you might want to decrease the amount of margins on the page. But in other places, right, you might want lesser area for a content. You want to give it more identity, right? In that case, you can add a lot of margin. In this case, I'm adding 64 dB margin to the edge. Just by playing with all these different values, uh, you can give a different feel to the application. Next, I'd like to talk about density. Density is how closely packed your element should be, right? Apart from just resizing elements, you might also want to pack more information in a very specific area. So just by applying density, a typical row on the left hand side is about 48 dB. But if you want to pack more information in the same area, you can decrease that. You can increase the density and decrease the spacing. Right? It goes from 48 dB to 32 dB. It has the same kind of effect. You can see more content in the same area. So this is an example of one of the material design applications. Uh, these are applications which are hypothetical applications created by Google when they launched Material Design 2.0 last year. So in this application, you can see how in this format, everything is very dense in nature. Everything is very tightly packed, right? You can see that density is shown across the page, right? It's not just in one area. You can see the central area, which is very dense. On the right hand side, the alerts are also very, very dense in nature. The same application can be designed in a more light default manner, right? Over here, you can see the spacing has increased drastically, right? Gives a different look and feel to the application. It depends on how much information you want to show in the application. You can completely customize it as per your needs. It's the same grid, the same kind of column structure, but you're adjusting margins, you're adjusting gutters and the spacing between elements to uh, to fit your need. Let's also talk about typography and how does typography affect your grid. So as I said, we use a 4 dB baseline grid, and whatever text that you are using should align to that baseline grid of 4 dB. Okay, so whenever you're aligning text, this is very, very important. And as Android developers, I think we make a lot of mistakes when placing text. Text is always aligned to the baseline, right? You cannot measure text from the top of a text, the height of the text, right? It's always as per the baseline. So when we see a specific design and it says we 44 dB from certain place, it's always from the baseline. And just keep that in mind. Like everything else, you can also play with the density of text, and you can make it more tightly packed, but still aligned to the 4 dB baseline grid. Okay, on the left hand side, you have something which is uh, a default density. On the right hand side, the same thing has been compressed to a highly packed, very dense structure. Okay, so let's look at certain material studies. So Google launched this Material Design 2.0 last year. Along with that, they talked about different case studies which showcased the use of the grid and all these different material design components for those specific cases. So in case you want to learn how to use the material design or some of those components in various use cases, you can look at these case studies. They're very, very interesting. How many of you have heard of these case studies? Nobody? So I'll share some links. You can go and check them out. So for example, this is a recipe application. And you can see the complete thought process behind the design and how they developed everything is on the Google Material Design page. Right? You can see how going from a tablet design, it goes back down to a phone design. The same grid scales across different phone sizes. Right? And it's very interesting how they have designed this application. Another application is a travel application. In case you're building something in that domain, definitely check it out. It shows you how to highlight all that information and display it across different screen sizes. You can see how they have varied the margins and gutters, right? Very specifically for this use case. Apart from this, there are lots of other examples. There's a news application, right? If you're building a content-rich application, this is one uh, example that you should definitely look at, right? Again, it scales very, very well, and you can see how they have customized the columns across different devices. Another app is called Owl. It's an educational app. These are all case studies. These are not real applications that have been built, but it's just a hypothetical app which showcases a lot of the philosophy behind it. This is the other application. This is a finance application that we were talking about. And again, it works really, really well across different phone sizes. And they've also played around with density. You can change the mode from default to compact and so on. Okay, so a bunch of other case studies. I'll not talk about all of them. There's an email application, there's a retail application, right? So in case you want to see how you can use material design in your application or in a similar context, please feel free to go to that site and check those case studies out. Next, so I've talked about the grid and how you can design different things. But as a developer, uh, how can you see if you're doing the right thing? How can you align your application to the grid in the right way? So I'll talk about a couple of tools that you can use as a developer to see how your application behaves with the grid. So there are three tools that I would recommend, right, for this purpose. First is called keyline pushing. Okay, so this is an application. How many of you have heard of keyline pushing? Okay, nobody. It's a tool created by my fellow friend JD from India called Fez, and it's a very interesting tool. When you use this tool, it overlays uh, a, a grid on your application. Right? It could be on any application. It doesn't have to be just on the Keyline application. It could be on Gmail. It could be on the Play Store. And it gives you all the standard key lines, the typographic grid, the cards layout, anything that you would like to verify, you can do it very, very easily. Over here, I'm in the Play Store application, right? I'm checking how they have used key lines. So I want to inspect that and want to use the same thing for my application. So using keyline pushing, I can overlay the grid and see how things are working. Right? Um, Apart from that, there is the typographic grid. You want to see how what is the spacing between the title of a certain element and the paragraph. You can do it all using this application. Another really interesting tool is called Designer Tools. Apart from the grid overlay, which is there in Keyline Pushing, this gives you a bit of more functionality. It gives you something called the mockup overlay. Typically, what happens as developers, we get a design from the designer, right? And we have to replicate that screen in a real environment. This tool lets us import that mockup and overlay that mockup on our application. So once you've developed it, you can see if your application is actually conforming to that design. It's a very, very helpful tool. And of course, you can align it to the grid. So you can see if the grid, the mockup, as well as your actual app conforms to each other. Right? It's a very, very interesting tool. Has other elements like color picker and screenshot details. So you can figure out if your color is correct and you can inspect all these things. Right? So this is another tool which is very, very helpful. So that's it. I've given you a brief overview of the tool itself and then grid systems in general. If you would like to read further on how you can implement material design or the grid in your application, definitely head over to the material design site. It has a lot of the content I spoke about. It has really interesting case studies so that if you want to implement the material grid for your application, you can see how you can do that. It's a very, very great link. If you want to know more about the theory behind grid systems, there's a book I would recommend called Grid Systems in Graphic Design by Joseph Wheeler Brockman. It's a very old book. It's written in 1970, but it still holds up to today. Right? All the modern magazines, or mobile applications, everything uses the grids that he has specified, right, back in 1968. If you want a quick blog, just to understand all the things I talked about, right, like the type of grids and so on, quick look at grid types. This is a link that I can share. It gives you a lot of the same information in a very quick, digestible way, like easy to use. Okay, so that like to end. Right? Happy to answer any questions.